Thank you so much, Dr. Funabashi, for that very generous introduction. I should note that we have, to your point about the American century, that there is an article in our new issue, the July-August issue, by Joseph Nye, who is, of course, very well known to all of you, such an important figure in the US-Japan relationship, such an important figure in the study of international relations. He contributed an essay that he finished just before he passed away in May, that we were very honored and lucky to have in this issue, called "The End of the Long American Century." So it very much picks up that point you were making. I suppose it would be 103 years by that count, but close enough. So let me just begin again by profusely thanking Dr. Funabashi for that generous introduction, and International House of Japan for hosting me. It's a great honor to be here, so thank you, James Kondo. Thanks to everyone here at iHouse who has shown such warm hospitality and also put together just such a rich set of conversations for me over my short time here. It's too short, but extremely productive. I feel especially obligated to do whatever I can to say something of use to all of you tonight, given how much I will take from these few days back as I think about what we should be doing in the pages of foreign affairs at such a fascinating and challenging moment in history for the United States, for Japan, and for the rest of the world. That may not be exactly what you had in mind, James and Dr. Funabashi, in inviting me, but it really has been hugely generative for me as an editor, trying to identify the right questions, the issues in our attempt to shed light on the world today and really drive the kinds of discussions and arguments and debates that I hope will help all of us find ways forward within these turbulent times, to use the well-chosen word that James used earlier. And let me just take a brief digression to say how important, I think, welcome it is that iHouse, which of course has an incredibly distinguished history in so many areas, has committed to playing a greater role on this set of issues as well, the debate and analysis of international affairs, Japanese foreign policy, the alliance. It's, again, just such an important moment. There are so many big questions to work through for all of us. And so it's, I think, a very, very good thing to have an institution of this stature, of this depth, taking on that task that, of course, has huge relevance for debates about Japan's policies in many areas and Japan's role in the world. But I would venture to say that it also has considerable relevance for the global debate as well, whether that's on geoeconomics and trade, really at the center of the alliance and international affairs today, or about the future of global order and geopolitics, the US-Japan alliance, China's rise, so much else. Let me also just indulge a bit in some further discussion of Foreign Affairs magazine, my institution, and our mission, because I think it really resonates with the task that iHouse has set out for itself, and also for the challenge to the policy community in the United States and globally at this moment. You know, when I go back to the origin of the magazine in 1922, the mission that was set out then, obviously in a very different moment in history, is in some ways very similar to the one we still carry out today. There's been a huge change in formats and the ways we communicate, but the way we think about our mission is actually quite consistent. And there are two things when I go back to the very first issue of Foreign Affairs, published in September 1922, that still stand out to me. First is looking at the opening essay of that first issue. It was written by Elihu Root, the former Secretary of State. And he made at that time what I think seemed to people like a sort of radical claim. The idea that the development of foreign policy in the United States or in any other democracy wasn't just a task for people sitting in foreign ministries or the office of heads of state or even just in militaries, but that it had to be a democratic exercise, that it needed to draw on a much broader range of voices and perspectives. And Root wrote in this piece, and the language is a little antiquated, but I think the point comes across, quote, "Democracies determined to control their own destinies object to being led without their knowledge into situations where they have no choice. But the determination of populations to play a role in decision-making had to be matched," he said, "with knowledge of the fundamental and essential facts and principles on which the relations of our nations depend." And that is really, in some ways, at the center of what we do now. We aim to drive a debate that, by design, spans both experts, whether practitioners or scholars or journalists or anyone else, and a much broader engaged readership. back in the beginning of Foreign Affairs, or even in the, kind of glory days of the magazine, that some people look back to as the golden age when George Kennan and Henry Kissinger were writing about early Cold War policy and had great influence in shaping that. That readership might have been 20,000 people, 25,000 people. And it's really remarkable to me that we can now reach not just, our circulation, our print copy goes to more than 200,000 people now in the US and around the world. And then, of course, because of what we can do online and what we publish every day and in the print magazine, several million more every month pick up Foreign Affairs in some form and read it. I went and checked the data, and just in the last 3 weeks, 16,000 people in Japan have read Foreign Affairs. So that was certainly not the case back in 1922 or even in the 1950s. And that, to me, is a very good thing. The second thing, and going back to that original issue that I think remains quite central to what we do, is the mandate from the founding editor, Archibald Carey Coolidge, who specified when presenting the first issue that, quote, "These contributions do not represent any consensus of beliefs, but rather reflect a pledge to tolerate wide differences of opinion, seriously held and convincingly expressed." And that meant that, as he put it, Foreign Affairs doesn't accept responsibility for the views expressed in any article, but it does accept the responsibility for giving them the chance to appear here. And that, again, remains a core part of our mission, the idea that we should be facilitating a broad-ranging debate from practitioners, people with great credibility in their field, people with a perspective to offer and something clear to say, but without having an editorial line. We believe that engagement in the world is important, but there are lots of ways that can be carried out, and we seek to really present a wide range of perspectives, wide range of policy options, and to facilitate a good faith debate. As long as it's happening in good faith, that to us is a positive contribution. And again, the format has changed, but that ambition is very much there, and we seek with really anything we publish to make sure that every piece has some ambition to drive or change or start a debate. We are not simply reacting to the news. We are not covering the news as the journalists in this room do so well, but instead attempting to look ahead and think about what the debate should be, what issues are coming, where assumptions need to be questioned or challenged, and how we do that with credible people who bring real perspective and real depth, whether as practitioners who have served in government or elsewhere, or as scholars or journalists or whatever else. And then two other qualities that, again, are just really essential to that mission. One, we ask authors to be constructive in the sense that they should have some recommendation for what to do about a problem. For any of you who are in government or have served in government, you know very well that you're typically dealing with the best of bad options, as the cliche goes. You know that no option is optimal. There are risks, there are trade-offs, there are costs with any one. So for people to sit outside and say, that's not a perfect option is not especially useful. So we ask our authors to, in critiquing an existing policy, identifying a problem, to say something about how they would go about solving it, why they think that's a better approach, what they think the risks and trade-offs of their preferred recommendation would be. And that to us is both important for a policy journal to do. It should have some constructive, practical implications. But there's also a kind of intellectual and ethical discipline to that. Attempt to show that you are not merely, lobbing criticisms from the sidelines, but willing to take risks in proposing your own arguments. And I'll come back to that idea of risk-taking again later in the conversation. And then I would just stress again that for all of the ways in which Foreign Affairs is thought of as an elite institution, and we seek to have the highest credibility for any of our authors, we work extremely hard to make it accessible to non-expert readers. So we think that all of these pieces should be able to be read by those who are working in the field every day, that they are must-reads for people who are working on some specific issue. If it's a piece about, alliance issues in Asia, we want everyone who works on those issues professionally, whether as scholars or as policymakers, to feel like they have to engage with that piece and read with that piece, whether they agree or disagree with it. But we don't think there has to be a trade-off. We don't think there has to be a choice between reaching that audience and also presenting essays and arguments that are accessible to average citizens. We think often of the smart college student. No matter how technical or complicated the topic, we truly believe that with the right presentation, editing, and explanation, you can deliver arguments that are both sophisticated and speak to that expert and professional audience, and also reach that broader readership. And that goes back to that democratic mission. So I say all of that because I think it remains very central to what we do at the magazine, but I think is also a part of the task for the broader policy community and conversation in this moment. And from what I've heard about the iHouse approach in the last couple of days, I think it's very, very central to the way you all are thinking about it now. Now, in the United States today, it is an occupational hazard for anyone who works in policy or politics or journalism to think and talk about nothing but Donald Trump day after day after day. And I would venture to guess, given events in the US-Japan relationship in the last few days, that applies to many of you here as well, perhaps not to the same degree, but he, of course, has taken up much of the conversation in recent months, and there's obviously good reason for that. I think that's one of Trump's great political skills in some ways, his ability to dominate media and public conversation. That's really been true throughout his life. He's an entertainer at heart, and he's done an incredible job of creating this public personality and keeping us all fixated on it. And there's obviously plenty of reason for that, given the changes in the United States and changes in the American role in the world in the last 6 months. But there is a downside to this fixation on Trump, in my view. It makes it all too easy to lose perspective, both historical and global, on some of the changes underway. And so what I hope to do today is to talk a bit about Trump, and I'm happy to talk more about Trump in the course of Q&A, but I'm going to do my best to try to look at some of the deeper currents in American foreign policy especially, and geopolitics more broadly, and point to some of the questions that I see them raising, some of which I think are especially vital to Japan, and questions that really need Japanese work and perspectives and voices to come up with good answers and policy solutions. I was reminded in revisiting a piece that Dr. Funabashi wrote in, I believe it was 1987, do I have that date right? A column he wrote looking back at pieces on Japan and foreign affairs over the previous, I suppose, 65 years at that point. And it was a really nice reminder that so many of the tensions that we look at in the relationship today are not entirely new. The crises may be more acute in some ways or feel more urgent. But if you look at alliance tensions going back decades, as all of you know, this is not entirely unfamiliar territory. There were tensions even going back before World War II over China, of course, and over migration issues. So all of this feels very familiar in the American debate now. And I think about the work I did for my own book on the early Cold War. So much of the debates now about China and America's role in Asia, about how you prioritize between different geographies and different theaters, again, refer back to this history. So I think it's useful to try to retain some of that historical perspective. And then I think it's also worth, when looking at American foreign policy today, just to remember that some of the changes that Trump tends to embody in somewhat more theatrical and erratic form, in fact, reflect much deeper changes in the nature of American foreign policy today. And I think you can see that in lots of dimensions, but the one that really stands out as I look at foreign policy across the last 3 administrations, going from Trump 1 to Biden to Trump 2, is the way in which this focus on great power competition, as we talk about in the United States, has become really the governing principle for American foreign policy. And you could see that in China policy most clearly. For all of the criticism of Trump that dominated American politics in the first Trump term before Biden came into office, Biden kept many of the elements of Trump's China policy. He kept the tariffs in place despite having criticized them. Many of the mechanisms that had developed under Trump, and many of the basic statements of policy did not change that dramatically under Biden, nor did the Taiwan exercises. Many of the key multilateral efforts, such as the Quad, or even the efforts to develop the trilateral relationship between Japan, the U.S., and the ROK, those are in some ways very, very stable parts of American foreign policy. And the way in which other conflicts, other crises in other regions have become folded into great power competition and considered in the context of great power competition, again, is very, very stable as a part of foreign policy, as is, of course, the inability of the United States to leave the Middle East, which we've been trying to do since I was in government 15 years ago. So I say all that just to give us a reminder that while we can be consumed by Trump and see all of this as fundamentally radically new, and some of it, of course, is, there is, if you step back and look at this historical perspective, it's worth reminding ourselves that it's not entirely unfamiliar. But with that goal of trying to identify deeper currents, I want to surface, I think, 5 central issues in American foreign policy today that connect to some of these broader geopolitical trends. All have a certain kind of expression in the Trump foreign policy, but each really grows out of a much more fundamental shift, both in American thinking about foreign policy and in geopolitics more broadly. And notably, as I think will become clear as I work through these, Japan really does have a unique perspective on these, given its own firsthand experience grappling with some of these dynamics in some ways before the rest of us have. And that gives, I think, Japanese scholars and policymakers and analysts and journalists really a unique role in trying to help us understand them and also work through policy solutions, especially in the context of the alliance. So those issues that I'll spend some time on are the future of alliances, the effort to contend with China, the linkage of different theaters and the challenge of prioritization, which I think is at the center of American foreign policy right now, deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons, and then finally economic security and trade. There's obviously a lot else that I think we could spend time on, demographics or AI and technology, climate and energy, but in an effort to let all of you get out of here before midnight, I will limit myself to those few. Now, if you'll let me indulge Trump talk for just 1 second, because it's a little bit difficult not to. I do think there are 2 things about Trump and Japan that are worth reminding ourselves of. The first is when you look at Trump's worldview. I mean, for all the ways in which Trump is so erratic and so volatile, he's in some ways quite consistent in his core beliefs and his core fixations when it comes to America and the rest of the world. And so much of that worldview is shaped by the 1980s, when, of course, Japan-US tensions were at their height, and in the popular imagination in the United States, there was a sense of, this looming threat from Japan, in a sense that this was the kind of great clash of our time. That, of course, dissipated very, very quickly. But when I think Trump's thinking about the world was shaped, that was very, very front of mind. And it's worth going back. This might seem like a bizarre suggestion from the editor of Foreign Affairs, but one text that I would suggest you study is an interview that Trump gave to Oprah in 1988, where he talks about, let me quote him briefly, and I will not try to imitate his voice, but he says, quote, "I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets. It's not free trade. I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. You can respect someone that's beaten the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country." Then he goes on to talk about Kuwait and how the Kuwaitis should be paying 25% of their oil revenue to the United States. If you substitute China for Japan and probably Ukraine for Kuwait now, you could imagine him saying exactly this today. And so it's worth going back and looking at. There's also a Larry King interview where he talks about Japan from 1987, which is similarly illuminating in certain ways. And I think that points to this point, the term victimhood, which you used in your piece. That is really the most striking thing about Trump and his worldview, and in some ways this current in American politics right now. You don't talk to a lot of foreign leaders and foreign officials, non-American officials, who think they're really taking advantage of the United States. I don't think that's a kind of common view outside of the US, but there is this deeply held view of victimhood, to again use that term, the sense that the US has been taken advantage of. And Joe and I might have talked of this as a kind of enlightened self-interest model, right? That there was reason to be trustworthy and consistent, and sometimes you pay more in order to have long-term cooperation. But that is just not the sense that anyone in the Trump orbit has, and I think that's baffling for good reason to many foreign officials who interact with them. One finance minister said to me in looking at the obsession with trade deficits that is driving Trump right now, said, do you know how easy my job would be if I could run the kind of deficits the US can? If he could run the fiscal deficits the United States does year after year, it would make everyone else's work quite easy. The second thing I think it's worth reminding ourselves of is that in Trump 1, it was a Japanese leader who set the gold standard for strategic diplomacy with Trump in his first term. And of course, Dr. Funabashi has written about this probably more expertly than anyone. But so many allies right now are studying Prime Minister Abe's lessons in trying to manage Trump this time around. And I know from talking to some of the people around the European leaders who seem to have done an okay job of this so far, whether that's Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, or Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor. There are a few others who seem to be, for now, doing okay. And all of them look at the Abe model, which has a degree of flattery. That was certainly part of it. But there was also, I think, more to it, more substance and more principle to it. And I think the ones who are succeeding have managed to learn that lesson. It may also be worth studying the Abe's successor as prime minister, who's probably a reminder to all of them who feel like they're doing well okay that nothing is stable and they should not count on that lasting. So with that, let me move on from Trump and look at some of those deeper currents. I'll start with the future of alliances, because I know this is front of mind for people here, but I think also really at the center of American strategic debates right now. We are, of course, sitting here at a moment of unique challenge for the US-Japan relationship. It is certainly one of America's most important allies, and I hope I'm not presumptuous in saying that it is still, for now, Japan's most important relationship, and that will presumably remain true for some time. For all of us who work on this day to day, I think the value of this is quite clear, both as a staple of international order, but as Japanese leaders have tried to remind Trump and Trump officials, it's also the amount of foreign investment that the Japanese pour into the United States. It's the advantage that American forces stationed here give to American strategy in the region, the trade relationship and everything else. But it's really not enough at this particular moment in time to fall back on those old staples of celebrating the alliance, real as they are, important as they are, because in American foreign policy, all of this is under renegotiation in profound ways. Some of this is about Trump, but I think it really does go beyond Trump. This is not simply a question of Trump's particular view of alliances in that sense of victimhood. It's a much deeper change that you could see even in elements of the Biden policy, and that I think will become a part of American policy going forward. Of course, the urgent task for you is managing the bilateral relationship through the Trump era, and Japan, I think, will play an incredibly important role, probably when you don't want to play, but it'll be an incredibly important role in determining and shaping the future of bilateral alliances in the United States. And I've heard plenty the last couple of days here just since arriving about how difficult that will be and how much trust will have been lost as a result of the tariff back and forth, if nothing else. I think we in the United States often forget that foreign leaders have domestic politics of their own. That's easy for American policymakers to forget, that there are domestic political repercussions that do have effects on what foreign leaders can do. But really beyond that bilateral relationship, but beyond the bilateral alliance, there will be in the coming years a wholesale rethinking of the structure of alliances in the U.S. system, and it's worth stressing how big a change that is. I think if you watch what's happening in Europe, it's in some ways instructive. The European alliance has been the longest standing one for the United States. The transatlantic alliance is really at the heart of American foreign policy and has been for some time. But for years, going back to George W. Bush, there's been growing dissatisfaction among American policymakers about a perceived lack of defense spending among Europeans, a sense that Europeans were not paying their fair share. And that has started to change in very dramatic ways, first because of Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, and then also with some added pressure from Donald Trump. But it's not just a matter of more defense spending in Europe. Really, the whole bargain that was at the center of that alliance system is changing. The notion that the U.S. would pay more for security, would commit to European security in exchange for a degree of deference on international security issues is going to come apart. And I think we are just starting to grapple in the United States with what that will mean for our foreign policy, and we're going to see similar changes to the alliance system in Asia. I think the big question now in this region is what it will mean to move beyond the hub and spoke model of American alliances that has served us quite well, I think served Japan quite well and served the United States quite well for some time. The Biden administration talked about a lattice work of kind of knitting together these various institutions, these smaller multilateral bodies, whether it was the Quad, whether it was trilateral cooperation between Japan and the ROK and the United States. Obviously, that Japan is at the center of these. All of this has continued, I think, under the Trump administration. Whether it will survive, I think, is a separate question. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio has, of course, been engaged in this quite intensively. And I think those will continue to be parts of American policy. But the big question going forward is what that adds up to, how we build on that. And let me cite two foreign affairs articles that I think start to get at some of these big questions about what the structure of alliances and partnerships in Asia looks like. The first is by Kurt Campbell, who I think is probably well known to this audience, former Deputy Secretary of State and longtime American Asia specialist, who wrote a piece co-authored with Rush Doshi, one of his colleagues in the Biden administration, called Underestimating China in a recent issue. And they call for not just thinking about the structure of alliances in different ways, but really asking for more from Asian partners in exchange for delivering more to Asian partners. And I'll quote them here. In raw terms, this alignment of democracies and market economies outscales China across nearly every dimension. Yet unless its power is coordinated, its advantages will remain largely theoretical. Accordingly, unlocking the potential of this coalition should be the central task of American statecraft in this century, and that cannot be done by simply doubling down on the traditional alliance playbook. It will require a level of coordination and codependence that is unfamiliar and will at times be uncomfortable for both the United States and its partners. That's, I think, the beginning of this discussion about what a new alliance system looks like. One thing they talk about as part of this is what they describe as an almost new Nixon doctrine, which is outsourcing problems to regional actors who are going to have to play a bigger role, a more active role, and perhaps a riskier role in solving some problems given U.S. overextension. I would also note that Eli Ratner, a former Defense Department official, went even further and called for a full-on collective defense pact involving Australia, Japan, the Philippines, the United States. So I don't offer these as definitive answers, but merely to say, I think these are the kinds of questions that American policymakers will be grappling with, and policymakers and analysts and scholars in this region will have a key role in shaping, because going back to the old way, I simply will not be an option in the wake of Trump. And part of what's so interesting about Japan's position is that it really does sit at the center of so many of these. I mean, it is a hub of its own in many ways. When you look at all these overlapping groupings, so it will have a really unique role in both intellectually and diplomatically shaping the future of these. Let me go to the second point of how we collectively manage a very different China than we had 10 or 20 years ago. And in this region, the question of alliances is obviously driven in part by that question of how we manage China. You've seen in the United States a long-term reassessment of U.S.-China policy. This goes back, I think, to early in Trump's first term, but had been gathering strength over the years before that, really going back to early in the Obama administration. And of course, Japan was well ahead of the United States here at a time when Americans were still looking for, I think, a deeper relationship and a sense of real collaboration. You know, G2, a U.S.-China G2 was the slightly crude and caricatured way of putting it, but at times when American policymakers still had that kind of hope for the U.S.-China relationship, I think many Japanese interlocutors, both in government and without, were starting to highlight some of the changes in Chinese policy that we saw even before Xi Jinping. All of you know some of the crises of the Hu Jintao years that I think changed thinking here in Japan. And of course, when Shinzo Abe's government released its strategy in, I believe, 2013, that was in some ways a wake-up call to many Americans who were a little slower to register what had changed about China. But even for the change, this sense that the era of engagement, as we talk about in the United States, was over and had failed to realize its goals of a kind of liberalizing, changing China, there still is a big question, an unsettled question of what exactly the objective of American China policy is. So for all of the articles in Foreign Affairs that have been written about strategy towards China, all of the attempts to articulate this from government officials and others, there is this core question of the ends of American policy towards China that is still very much up for debate and that I think has to be figured out in coordination with allies. We've published a number of articles in our pages that attempt to get at this. I go often to a piece that Jake Sullivan wrote with Kurt Campbell, once again, called Competition Without Catastrophe in 2019, where they lay out this basic framework of competing while still cooperating to manage some of the downside risks of competition. But even Kurt and Jake, two very smart, experienced policy hands, can't quite identify the end of that other than a kind of continual improvisation. And that has led to a series of other positions that I think are continuing to echo in American policy debates about other kinds of objectives. The most prominent one, again, pointing to a piece in Foreign Affairs, was offered by Matt Pottinger, prominent Trump China official, Trump 1 China official, along with Mike Gallagher, a Republican member of Congress who is a very influential member on China, where they argued for essentially trying to change the nature of power in China. You know, they stress that it's not regime change in the Iraq sense, but that it should be the objective of the U.S. and its allies to ultimately undermine CCP power and try to promote over the long term a change in government, which in some ways was very similar to American Cold War strategy when you go back and read, you know, Kennan's containment articles and others that attempted to lay that out. And of course, one of the responses to this, one of the critiques of that argument is that it'd be very hard to get allies in this region to sign on to that agenda. But again, I think that's a theme that's going to be echoing in American policy debates going forward for some time. And you see even parts of it in the Trump administration. I think there are splits in how the administration thinks about it. There are some who are much less ideological and have a more kind of isolationist or restraint-minded impulse, but there are some in the administration who really do see this as part of America's objective. There's so many questions that flow from, leaving aside the regime change point, this question of how we develop a common strategy toward China. There's, of course, how you bring together the tech and economic elements, which I think is still very complicated and unsettled. And then there's this, you know, question of what kind of relationship you have in China even as you compete, you know, how to balance this, you know, what can be a mutually beneficial economic relationship with very, very intense security competition. It's a very difficult one for the United States to figure out, given some of the absolute terms in which we tend to see these things. And Japan, of course, is sitting at the front lines of that. And I think has a lot to teach us in trying to work through that balance. And this does, of course, also go back to the question of alliances. I've heard many people here ask why Trump would be tariffing an ally, even as he asks them to do more on this priority, which is an absolutely fair question. But I think when we look beyond Trump, the structure of alliances in Asia will continue to be really at the center of America's China strategy. And it's worth just reminding ourselves again and again how powerful that alliance is, both when you look at the Asian alliances, but also when you look at the alliance system more broadly, and how much that still outweighs Chinese presence for all of China's growth in recent years. I think another debate in the US, just worth flagging briefly because it goes to the center of some of the rifts you see in the Trump administration, but also some of the debates about our policy more broadly, is how you think about global priorities. I mean, there's a strong sense that America is overextended given the wars that it has been involved in the Middle East over the last 20 years and over the last couple of years in the case of Gaza and Iran, Ukraine, and then the priority of trying to maintain a presence here and really shore up deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. I go back to the time when I was in government and in the Obama administration when we were working on the pivot, which was supposed to be a shift away from the era of wars in the Middle East. And we've been really struggling to pivot ever since. You know, that's more than 15 years since, or almost 15 years since that was first articulated. And the challenge for the United States to figure out how to balance risks in the Middle East, commitment to Ukraine, and the need to really establish a stronger presence in this region, I think has become quite a challenging one and has led to some of the most fervent debates in foreign policy. Ukraine, to take one, where there is this ongoing debate, you see it in very, very sharp form in the Trump administration, about whether the American commitment to Ukraine is essential to our credibility in this region, whether Asian allies and partners look at American commitment and the sustainability of the commitment as a sign of trust and a sign of staying power in a way that China will really register and think about, or whether it is simply a diversion from this greater task. And that is at the center of the debates you see in the Trump administration about, you see it in the famous Signal chat, which is, famous for other reasons, but is in fact a really interesting debate about where American strategic priorities should be focused. Let me briefly mention what is, of course, a very delicate issue in this country, and that's the risk of further nuclear proliferation. I think it's, impossible to separate the China question from the questions of deterrence, and that, of course, brings up the nuclear dynamic very, very quickly, which is distressing for lots of reasons. I go back to, again, my time in government in 2009, a time when Barack Obama was talking about a world without nuclear weapons, and figures like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and William Perry were writing op-eds together calling for getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether, which seemed like a plausible goal to them at that point. At this point, when we look at where we are in what is really a new nuclear age, we're seeing arms control vanish almost entirely. In 2026, the New START agreement between the United States and Russia will probably be gone, absent some diplomatic surprise. Ukraine has brought back the threat of Russian nuclear use. I'm struck when talking to people who were in the Biden administration who are very experienced, such as the CIA director, Bill Burns, that they thought there was a very high risk of a Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and that really was a shock to people who had lived through the post-Cold War era, a time when that seemed to be a thing of the past. And then, of course, the reminders of the risk of the Indian-Pakistan relationship. There was a clash just 2 months ago between two nuclear powers that could have escalated to nuclear use very, very quickly. And then, along with all of this, is an enormous Chinese buildup in its nuclear weapons arsenal that is changing the deterrence calculus for the United States in very, very fundamental ways. As American planners look at a situation where you have a Russian nuclear arsenal and a Chinese nuclear arsenal, it's scrambling all of the calculations about nuclear stability and all the strategic questions that are suddenly alive again. I think there are two kinds of proliferation risks that I would also highlight. The first is the one that comes to the foremost when you look at Iran, and of course this was consuming all of us in the United States just a few weeks ago in the war between Israel and Iran and the US strikes. I think what people will take from the Iranian experience is that you'd rather be North Korea right now, that you'd rather be Kim and have the weapon and be in a pretty good position. But as you look at what has happened to Iran, you look at what has happened to Gaddafi in Libya, who gave up his weapons, you look at Saddam Hussein, and you look at Ukraine, frankly, for Ukraine, which gave up nuclear weapons with reassurance from the Russians and the United States that they would not be invaded. All of those are lessons that if you're a small state, it's a good idea to have nuclear weapons. And if you're going to do it, you should do it decisively and not sit at the threshold as Iran did, thinking that would give you some leverage. Instead, it becomes simply a source of threat. And then the second proliferation risk is, of course, that extended deterrence, United States extended deterrence starts to erode. And the fears about alliance commitments that are front and center right now, I think, are sowing those kinds of questions among a number of allies and partners. And I can imagine many of them saying what Charles de Gaulle did in 1963 when France developed its own nuclear force. He said, quote, "American nuclear weapons remain the essential guarantee of world peace, but it remains that American nuclear power does not necessarily respond immediately to all the eventualities concerning Europe and France. Thus, we have to equip ourselves with an atomic force that is unique to us." And there are figures and governments in Europe certainly asking that question again. You saw just last week an agreement between the UK and France to engage in some nuclear sharing, which was certainly not something I would have imagined a couple of years ago. You have discussions of extending the French and British nuclear umbrella to other European powers, and you have the president of Poland talking about Poland developing a nuclear weapon. And then, of course, in Asia, you have Korea thinking very seriously about it. I think the polling puts it at about 70% support in South Korea. And that would, of course, raise the very, very difficult question of what Japan does. And I would not presume to say anything about how the debate should be carried out, only that I think there's a decent chance that it will become a very, very urgent and difficult one in the years ahead. And finally, let me just mention briefly that the economic security questions, even going beyond trade, I think represent a fundamental change in the way Americans think about the global economy and how it intersects with national security, and will be a really interesting question to be worked out by American scholars and Japanese scholars working separately and together in the years ahead. The change in American thinking that I've seen over the course of my career is really striking, the way that national security, which used to be very, very narrowly defined, used to know what that meant when we talked about national security in economic debates, that has become paramount, and its definition has grown and grown and grown month by month. The Biden administration talked about a small yard and a high fence in discussing technology controls. And even those were serious people who were trying to put limiting factors on it, but even they struggled to prevent more and more from being thrown into the category of national security. So I think when we look at these global economic questions, even leaving Trump aside, that security, sometimes national security will be abused, as it often is, to, as an excuse for aluminum tariffs on Canada, which I don't see as a real national security threat to the United States. But some of this will be done seriously, and it'll be a really hard issue for allies to work out together, especially in the context of tech competition. And I will also just say very, very briefly, without going too far down into the trade discussion, given its complexities at this particular moment, I think the question of how we work out a rules-based system for global trade without the multilateral system that has existed for the past several years is going to be one of the really, really urgent questions for thinkers and policymakers in both the U.S. and Japan. My colleague Mike Froman, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and the former U.S. trade representative, so he knows something about this, stresses, the thing that we have to preserve is some degree of predictability, so we don't have a kind of totally out of control world, but we have to accept that we're not going to have the same structures for using it. So it will be an incredibly difficult intellectual and policy task constructing that new system. Let me close with just a couple of thoughts before we go to Q&A about geopolitical debate going forward and how Japan could and does and will fit into it. I certainly am not and would not presume to push for certain answers to the kinds of questions as to what Japanese policy should be as it grapples with these dynamics. But my point is that I think grappling with some of these questions is essential now for people outside of government, especially where there's room for creativity and there's room for risk-taking, posing new ideas and debating new ideas. And that, to me, is very much in the spirit of what we try to do at Foreign Affairs Magazine, and Japanese perspectives, I think, will be incredibly critical to doing that going forward. I would also say it's a time when we need to bring together a wide variety of voices and perspectives in these discussions. It's not simply a matter of having different silos and different discussions. That extends really to business, which I think has often been left out of the foreign policy discussion. I think there was a time when all of you who are in the business community were probably happy to ignore some of these geopolitical dynamics, at least in your professional lives. I think that's probably not a luxury any of you have at this point, and I imagine all of you spend a certain amount of time thinking about what a crisis in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere would mean for your business and planning around it. But the conversation, I think, also has to go the other way. It's a moment when so many policy tools depend on the role of business, the reaction of business. If you think about export controls or technology competition, even the defense industrial base, which is such a critical issue in this region and in the United States and in Europe for that matter, all of that is about how policymakers and business work together. So I think we need a much richer discussion going in both directions between those, and you could extend that to lots of other silos as well. But that's one that really really comes to mind. And let me just stress in closing that creativity and risk-taking, I think, is really essential right now. This is one of the most interesting and challenging moments in 80 years, a moment of real change in the global order. And when you look back at the work that thinkers did in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, trying to shape the system that then lasted for decades after that, they were willing to take risks and say bold things and say controversial things and debate them fervently, but though in good faith. And I think that this is a moment when we need a similar degree of risk-taking and intellectual commitment to come up with solutions that are going to shape the world order going forward. So I hope that we can be a part of that at Foreign Affairs. I look forward to iHouse being a part of that, and I hope we can continue this conversation as we all try to figure out a way forward together. Thank you so much.
ダニエル・カーツ・フェラン様、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.